The roar of engines cuts through a storm that meteorologists declared unsurvivable. Inside the cockpit of a damaged C-130 transport, a pilot's hands move with supernatural precision across controls that should no longer respond. 180 wounded soldiers lie in the cargo bay behind her, their lives hanging in the balance as she attempts what every aviation expert has deemed impossible. But this isn't just a story about flying through the storm of the century. This is about a woman carrying the weight of her father's destroyed legacy, forced to choose between the safety of anonymity and the courage to reveal abilities that could save lives, or destroy her career, just as they destroyed his. Major Jessica Carter has spent 15 years hiding her extraordinary talents, flying just well enough to serve without attracting the attention that once brought down the most principled pilot the Air Force had ever known. But when a medical emergency demands the impossible, when conventional procedures mean certain death for the wounded heroes in her care, Jessica must decide. Will she remain in the shadows, or will she risk everything to prove that some things are worth more than personal safety? Tonight's story will take you into the heart of a storm where the line between heroism and recklessness disappears, where split-second decisions determine who lives and who dies, and where a daughter's courage must overcome a father's haunting legacy. This is a tale of sacrifice, redemption, and the extraordinary power that lies dormant within ordinary people, waiting for the moment when moral conviction overcomes personal fear. Before we begin this incredible journey, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Are you joining us from a military base, your hometown, or somewhere across the globe? And here's a question that goes to the heart of tonight's story. What do you think makes the difference between a good pilot and a legendary one? Is it technical skill, natural talent, or something deeper, the courage to make impossible choices when lives depend on it? Get ready for a story that will remind you why we honor those who serve and why sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names we never know. The storm is waiting. The mission is impossible, but courage makes all the difference. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Major Jessica Carter completed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. Her fingers traced the aircraft's surface with practiced care, checking every rivet and panel of the F-16 Fighting Falcon that gleamed silver in the Nevada desert light. At 32, she had earned respect as a competent pilot, though few suspected the extraordinary abilities she deliberately kept hidden beneath a facade of professional adequacy. "Phoenix, you're cleared for takeoff on runway 09, crackled the voice in her headset. Jessica acknowledged with crisp professionalism, sliding her helmet over dark brown hair pulled into a regulation bun. Her green-grey eyes reflected years of careful restraint as she settled into the cockpit that felt more like home than any place on Earth. The training mission proceeded exactly as planned. Jessica flew with textbook precision, executing maneuvers that were flawless but unremarkable. When Captain Stevens pushed his aircraft into an aggressive climb that bordered on showboating, Jessica maintained formation with steady competence, resisting every instinct that screamed for her to demonstrate the aerial artistry flowing through her veins like inherited fire. After landing, she watched Stevens receive congratulations for his exceptional flying while she completed her post-flight checklist in silence. The familiar sting of deliberate mediocrity settled in her chest, a price she had chosen to pay 15 years ago when her world shattered. The memory surfaced unbidden as she walked toward the hangar. Colonel Marcus Maverick Carter had been everything a military pilot should be: courageous, skilled beyond measure, and utterly devoted to protecting innocent lives. Jessica remembered the day he returned from his final mission, his face etched with the weight of an impossible choice. He had disobeyed direct orders to evacuate civilians from a bombed hospital, saving 300 lives but destroying his own career in the process. Sometimes doing what's right means paying a price others won't understand, he had told 17-year-old Jessica as military police escorted him to his court-martial. But you have to live with yourself, Phoenix. That matters more than any medal or promotion. The court-martial had been swift and merciless. Colonel Carter was stripped of rank, forced into early retirement, and branded as insubordinate despite the lives he had saved. Jessica watched her hero become a cautionary tale, learning that exceptional ability combined with moral courage could be more dangerous than enemy fire. She had entered the Air Force Academy, determined to honor her father's memory while protecting herself from his fate. Excellence became her secret, competence her shield. She flew well enough to serve her country, but never so brilliantly as to attract the attention that had destroyed the man she admired most. Thunder rumbled across the desert, drawing Jessica from her memories. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon with unusual speed, their towering formations promising the kind of storm that grounded aircraft and tested even the most experienced pilots. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain and the electric tension that preceded nature's most violent displays. "All personnel, this is base operations," announced the loudspeaker system. "Severe weather warning in effect. All non-essential flights are cancelled effective immediately." Jessica quickened her pace toward the operations building, her pilot's instincts reading the atmospheric pressure changes that spoke of something far more dangerous than a typical desert thunderstorm. The base bustled with activity as ground crews secured aircraft and personnel prepared for what meteorologists were already calling a potentially historic weather event. Inside the operations center, she found organized chaos. Weather maps displayed a massive storm system approaching with unprecedented intensity, while communication channels crackled with reports from aircraft struggling to return to base before conditions became impossible. "Phoenix, good timing," called Technical Sergeant Murphy, his weathered face creased with concern. "We might need every available pilot before this thing hits." Before Jessica could respond, the emergency alert system pierced the air with its urgent wail. Red lights flashed throughout the building as the announcement that would change everything echoed through the corridors. Medical emergency evacuation required. 180 wounded personnel require immediate transport to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. All available aircraft and crews report immediately. The briefing room filled rapidly as pilots, crew chiefs, and medical personnel responded to the emergency call. General Patricia Hayes stood at the front, her steel-grey hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, multiple ribbons on her chest catching the fluorescent light. Her presence commanded immediate silence as weather maps and casualty reports flashed across the wall-mounted screens. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical situation," General Hayes began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. 180 wounded soldiers from Operation Desert Shield require immediate medical evacuation. These men and women have sustained severe injuries and need advanced surgical care that only Landstuhl can provide. Jessica took a seat in the back row, her trained eye studying the meteorological data displaying on the screens. Wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, zero visibility conditions, and severe turbulence extending from ground level to 30,000 feet painted a picture that made even veteran pilots shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The problem," continued General Hayes, "is timing. Our weather team projects this storm system will intensify over the next 6 hours, making any flight impossible for at least 72 hours. These wounded soldiers don't have 72 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens raised his hand. "General, what about waiting for the eye of the storm?" "There is no eye, Colonel. This isn't a hurricane. It's a massive low-pressure system with embedded supercells that extends across 800 miles. Flying through it would be suicide for any normal aircraft under normal circumstances." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jessica watched seasoned pilots exchange glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. These were men and women who had flown combat missions, navigated through enemy fire, and faced death with professional calm. Yet the weather data before them represented something beyond human skill to overcome. However, General Hayes continued, we have one option. Our maintenance team has a C-130 Hercules that suffered hydraulic damage during yesterday's training exercise. Chief Murphy, please brief us on the aircraft's status. Technical Sergeant Murphy stood, his hands stained with hydraulic fluid despite his best efforts to clean them. Ma'am, the bird is flyable, but barely. We've got partial hydraulic failure in the primary system. Backup systems are functional but unreliable, and the weather radar took damage during the hard landing. She'll fly, but whoever takes her up will be doing it mostly by feel and instinct. Captain Rodriguez, one of the base's most experienced transport pilots, shook his head slowly. General, with respect, flying a damaged aircraft through conditions like these isn't just dangerous, it's impossible. The hydraulic issues alone would make controlling the aircraft in severe turbulence nearly impossible. I concur, added Major Thompson, another veteran pilot. Even with perfect weather, that aircraft would be challenging. In these conditions, we'd be risking not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone aboard. General Hayes studied the room, her gaze moving from pilot to pilot, as each one struggled with the same conclusion. The mission was beyond the capabilities of conventional flying skills, even with the most experienced crews. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder growing closer. General, Captain Rodriguez said finally, I've flown through some bad weather in my 15 years, but this would require someone with abilities beyond normal pilot training. We're talking about flying a crippled aircraft through conditions that would challenge even our best test pilots. Jessica felt her heart rate increase as she studied the mission parameters. Her mind automatically calculated wind vectors, turbulence patterns, and the precise control inputs that would be required to maintain stable flight. The damaged hydraulics would require constant compensation. The lack of weather radar would demand intuitive navigation through storm cells, and the wounded passengers would need the smoothest possible flight to survive the journey. Everything about the mission screamed impossibility to conventional thinking, but Jessica could see the solution as clearly as if it were written in the air before her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the impossible is just another word for untested. The room remained silent as General Hayes waited for volunteers that everyone knew wouldn't come. 180 lives hung in the balance while the storm continued its relentless approach toward the base. Jessica stood slowly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to. General, I volunteer for the mission. Every head in the room turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to outright disbelief. The silence that followed Jessica's volunteer statement stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Captain Rodriguez was the first to break it, his weathered face creasing with concern as he turned in his seat to face her. Phoenix, with all due respect, this isn't a routine transport mission, he said, his tone careful but firm. We're talking about flying a damaged aircraft through weather conditions that would ground our most experienced pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens nodded in agreement. Major Carter, your service record shows solid performance, but this mission requires someone with exceptional storm flying experience. Have you ever piloted through Category 5 equivalent conditions? Jessica met his gaze steadily, choosing her words with precision. I've flown through severe weather, sir. I understand the risks involved. General Hayes studied Jessica with calculating eyes, her expression unreadable. Major Carter, step forward. Jessica walked to the front of the room, acutely aware of every skeptical glance following her movement. She had spent years cultivating an image of competent adequacy, and now that carefully constructed facade was working against her when lives depended on revealing her true capabilities. "Your father was Marcus Carter," General Hayes stated, not asking a question. "Yes, ma'am. He was one of the finest pilots I ever served with, before his court-martial." The general's voice carried no judgment, only fact. "But exceptional bloodlines don't guarantee exceptional ability. What makes you think you can handle what these veteran pilots consider impossible?" Before Jessica could respond, Technical Sergeant Murphy's voice cut through the tension. "General, if we're doing this mission, we need to prep that bird immediately. Storm's moving faster than predicted." General Hayes nodded curtly. "Very well. Major Carter, you have 30 minutes to inspect the aircraft and decide if you're truly prepared to risk 180 lives on your assessment of your own abilities. Captain Rodriguez, you'll serve as co-pilot." Rodriguez started to protest, but the general's raised hand silenced him. "Captain, if Major Carter is going to attempt this, she needs an experienced co-pilot who can take over if necessary." The group moved quickly toward Hangar 7, where the damaged C-130 sat under harsh fluorescent lights. Jessica approached the aircraft with the methodical precision that had become second nature, but her examination revealed knowledge that surprised the watching maintenance crew. "The hydraulic leak is from the primary accumulator," she observed, running her fingers along a barely visible seepage mark that Murphy had missed. "The backup system will hold, but response time will be delayed by approximately 0.7 seconds on control inputs." Murphy's eyebrows rose. "How did you spot that? I've been working on this bird for 6 hours. Jessica continued her inspection, noting stress fractures in the wing root that would affect lift characteristics, identifying the precise nature of the weather radar damage, and calculating how the aircraft's center of gravity would shift with the weight of medical equipment and wounded passengers. "The radar dish is cracked, but the receiver is functional," she said, examining the damaged equipment. "We'll have partial weather detection capability, enough to identify the worst cells if we know how to interpret partial returns." Captain Rodriguez watched her with growing amazement. "Phoenix, where did you learn to read aircraft systems like that?" "My father taught me that understanding your aircraft is the difference between flying it and becoming one with it," Jessica replied, her hands continuing their expert assessment. Staff Sergeant Thompson, the flight medic, approached with a clipboard full of medical requirements. "Major, we'll have 23 critical patients who can't handle severe turbulence. Any significant G-forces could kill them." Jessica nodded, her mind already calculating the precise control inputs needed to maintain smooth flight despite the damaged hydraulics and severe weather. "We'll keep it steady, Sergeant, I promise." The loading process began with military efficiency. Wounded soldiers were carefully transferred into the aircraft's cargo bay, each one representing a life that depended on Jessica's hidden abilities. Medical equipment secured, emergency supplies loaded, and fuel topped off to maximum capacity despite the weight penalties. As the final preparations concluded, Captain Rodriguez pulled Jessica aside. "Phoenix, I need to ask you directly. Are you absolutely certain you can handle this? Because once we're airborne in that storm, there's no turning back." Jessica looked through the hangar doors at the approaching wall of black clouds, lightning flickering in their depths like trapped fire. Thunder rolled across the base with increasing frequency as the first drops of rain began to fall. "Captain, those soldiers in there trusted their country to bring them home safely. I won't let them down." Rodriguez studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or false bravado. Instead, he found something that reminded him of the legendary pilots he had served with in combat. A quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of achieving. "All right, Phoenix, let's go save some lives." The C-130's engines roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the aircraft's aluminum frame. Jessica settled into the pilot's seat, her hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency as she completed the pre-flight checklist. Rain hammered against the cockpit windows in sheets, driven by winds that already exceeded 40 miles per hour. "Tower, this is Mercy Flight 77 requesting immediate departure clearance," Jessica transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos building outside. "Mercy Flight 77, you are cleared for takeoff runway 09. Winds gusting to 60 knots, visibility less than 1/4 mile. Good luck out there." Captain Rodriguez gripped his armrest as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see ground crews running for shelter as the storm's leading edge swept across the base with frightening intensity. Lightning illuminated the darkness in brilliant, stroboscopic flashes that revealed the true magnitude of the weather system they were about to challenge. "Phoenix, the tower's reporting wind shear on final approach," Rodriguez said, monitoring the radio chatter. "2 aircraft have already declared emergencies trying to land." Jessica nodded, her eyes scanning the instruments as she lined up on the runway centerline. The damaged weather radar painted a partial picture of the storm ahead. Massive cells of turbulence extending from ground level to 40,000 feet, with embedded thunderstorms that would tear apart any aircraft unlucky enough to encounter them directly. "Mercy Flight, be advised, severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. Recommend you reconsider departure," the tower controller transmitted, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Tower, we have 180 souls depending on this flight. We're proceeding with takeoff." Jessica advanced the throttles, feeling the 4 turboprop engines respond with increasing power. The C-130 began its acceleration down the runway, rain and crosswinds buffeting the aircraft as it gained speed. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the yoke with smooth precision, and the heavily loaded transport lifted into the teeth of the storm. The turbulence hit them immediately. The aircraft bucked and rolled as invisible hands of wind tried to tear it from the sky. In the cargo bay, Staff Sergeant Thompson worked frantically to secure medical equipment that threatened to break free from its restraints. "Jesus," Rodriguez muttered, fighting to read his instruments as the aircraft shook violently. "Phoenix, we need to climb above this layer." "Negative," Jessica replied, her hands making constant micro-adjustments to the controls. "The storm extends to 35,000 feet. We go through it, not over it." What happened next left Rodriguez speechless. Despite the damaged hydraulics and severe turbulence that should have made controlled flight impossible, Jessica began to fly the aircraft with a precision that defied explanation. Her control inputs seemed to anticipate the wind gusts before they hit, compensating for the hydraulic delays with timing so perfect it appeared supernatural. The C-130 carved through the storm like a surgeon's scalpel, finding pockets of relatively calm air that existed for mere seconds between massive downdrafts and wind shear. Jessica's eyes never left the instruments, but her hands moved with an intuitive understanding of the aircraft's behavior that went far beyond normal pilot training. "How are you doing that?" Rodriguez asked, watching her maintain level flight through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. "Feel the aircraft, don't fight it," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Every airplane has a rhythm. You have to listen to what it's telling you." Behind them, the wounded soldiers lay secured in their litters, experiencing the smoothest possible ride that Jessica's extraordinary skills could provide. What felt like barely controlled chaos in the cockpit translated to gentle motion in the cargo bay, where critical patients remained stable despite flying through the storm of the century. 20 minutes into the flight, the first major system failure occurred. Warning lights illuminated the instrument panel as the primary hydraulic system finally succumbed to the damage sustained during the previous day's training accident. "Primary hydraulics are gone," Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concern. "We're down to backup systems only." Jessica felt the aircraft's response change immediately. Control inputs that had been precise now required significantly more force and produced delayed reactions. The C-130 became sluggish and unwieldy, like trying to steer a ship through molasses. "Phoenix, We need to declare an emergency and find the nearest airfield, Rodriguez urged. Negative. We continue to Landstuhl. Rodriguez stared at her in disbelief. With backup hydraulics only, in this weather, that's suicide. Jessica's hands never stopped their constant adjustments as she compensated for the system failure. Somehow, impossibly, she continued to maintain controlled flight through conditions that would challenge a fully functional aircraft with an experienced crew. Captain, those soldiers back there are counting on us. We don't quit. As if summoned by her words, another system alarm sounded. The backup hydraulic pressure was beginning to fluctuate, threatening to leave them with manual controls only. The backup hydraulic system's pressure gauge flickered between normal and critical as Jessica fought to maintain control through another violent downdraft. Each control input now required physical strength that left her arms aching, and the aircraft's response lagged dangerously behind her commands. In the cargo bay, medical alarms began sounding as the increasingly rough flight threatened the stability of critical patients. "Phoenix, we're losing backup hydraulics," Rodriguez called out, his voice strained as he monitored the cascading system failures. "If we lose manual control authority, we're done." Jessica's mind raced through emergency procedures, but conventional solutions wouldn't work in their current situation. The storm continued its relentless assault, wind sheer threatening to flip the aircraft inverted, while downdrafts tried to slam them into the earth below. Through the chaos, a memory surfaced with crystalline clarity. She was 17 again, standing in her father's study as he prepared for his final mission briefing. Colonel Marcus Carter had spread aerial photographs across his desk, studying satellite images of a bombed hospital surrounded by enemy forces. "The book says we extract military personnel only," he had told her, his finger tracing evacuation routes on the map. "But there are 300 civilians in that hospital, Phoenix. Children, doctors, nurses who stayed behind to help the wounded. What will you do, Dad?" What's right, not what's safe. His green eyes had met hers with unwavering determination. Sometimes you have to choose between following orders and following your conscience. The hard part is living with the consequences. Now, 15 years later, Jessica faced her own impossible choice. Standard emergency procedures demanded an immediate landing at the nearest airfield, abandoning the mission to save the aircraft and crew. But the nearest suitable runway was 200 miles away, and the wounded soldiers in her cargo bay didn't have 200 miles worth of time. "Captain, I need you to trust me," Jessica said, her hands making a series of control inputs that violated every emergency procedure in the manual. "Phoenix, what are you doing? You're descending into the worst part of the storm." Instead of climbing to escape the turbulence, Jessica was taking them deeper into the heart of the weather system, where wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour and lightning turned the sky into a deadly light show. To Rodriguez, it looked like suicide. To Jessica, it was the only path to salvation. "There's a wind pattern at 8,000 feet, she explained, her voice calm despite the aircraft shaking so violently that instruments became difficult to read. "The storm creates a corridor of relatively stable air between the upper and lower wind shears. We can ride it like a river current." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've studied weather patterns my entire life. Because my father taught me that sometimes the most dangerous path is actually the safest one." Jessica guided the crippled C-130 into what appeared to be certain destruction. The aircraft plunged through layers of turbulence that would have torn apart a lesser pilot's control, but her hands moved with supernatural precision, finding the invisible corridor she had identified through pure instinct and years of suppressed expertise. Suddenly, impossibly, the ride smoothed. They had found the eye of the storm's fury, a narrow band of relatively calm air that existed only because of the precise interaction between conflicting wind patterns. The aircraft still shook, but the violent bucking ceased, allowing Jessica to assess their situation. "I'll be damned," Rodriguez whispered, staring at the instruments in amazement. "How did you know that was there?" My father used to say that every storm has a secret. You just have to be willing to risk everything to find it. Behind them, Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice came over the intercom, with relief evident in her tone. "Cockpit, this is Doc. Whatever you just did, it worked. Patient vitals are stabilizing. But their reprieve was temporary. The hydraulic pressure continued to drop, and Jessica could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control. Worse, her unconventional route through the storm had taken them off their planned course, and with the damaged weather radar providing only partial information, navigation was becoming a matter of educated guesswork. "Phoenix, we're burning fuel faster than planned," Rodriguez reported, studying the consumption rates. "At this rate, we'll reach minimum reserves before we get to Landstuhl." Jessica nodded grimly. Every decision now carried life or death consequences, and she was rapidly approaching the point where even her extraordinary abilities might not be enough to save everyone aboard. The ghost of her father's court-martial haunted her thoughts. He had saved 300 lives, but destroyed his career in the process. "Captain, there's something you need to know," Jessica said, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "I'm not the pilot you think I am." Before Rodriguez could respond, another alarm sounded. The navigation system had failed completely, leaving them flying blind through the heart of the storm, with no way to determine their exact position. The navigation system's failure left them flying through the storm with only compass headings and Jessica's intuitive sense of direction. Rodriguez stared at the blank navigation display, then at Jessica, whose hands continued their precise control inputs despite the mounting system failures. "What did you mean, you're not the pilot I think you are?" Rodriguez asked, his voice cutting through the engine noise and wind, buffeting the aircraft. Jessica's eyes remained fixed on the instruments as she compensated for another hydraulic pressure drop. "I've been hiding my abilities for 15 years, Captain, flying just well enough to serve without attracting attention." "Hiding what abilities?" Instead of answering directly, Jessica demonstrated. With the manual controls becoming increasingly unresponsive, she began flying the aircraft in a way that defied conventional understanding. Her inputs seemed to anticipate the aircraft's behavior by several seconds, compensating for system delays and wind gusts before they fully developed. The C-130 carved through the turbulence with an elegance that should have been impossible given its damaged condition. Where other pilots would have fought the aircraft, Jessica moved with it, finding harmony between machine and storm that allowed them to maintain stable flight despite conditions that would have defeated most aviators. "Sweet Mother of God," Rodriguez whispered, watching her work. "You're flying this thing like it's a fighter jet." "My father taught me that every aircraft wants to fly. You just have to listen to what it's telling you and respond accordingly." In the cargo bay, Staff Sergeant Thompson noticed the change immediately. Despite the continuing storm and system failures, the wounded soldiers were experiencing the smoothest flight possible under the circumstances. Critical patients who had been deteriorating began to stabilize as Jessica's extraordinary piloting skills minimized the stress on their injured bodies. "Cockpit, this is Doc." Thompson's voice came over the intercom. "I don't know what you're doing up there, but keep doing it. We just had 3 patients move from critical to stable condition." Rodriguez studied Jessica with new understanding. "You've been capable of flying like this all along, since I was 22 and fresh out of advanced flight training. But I watched what happened to my father when he showed exceptional ability combined with independent judgment. The military doesn't always reward excellence, especially when it comes with a willingness to make difficult moral choices. So you've been flying at maybe 60% of your actual capability, less than that." The revelation explained everything Rodriguez had observed during their years of service together. Jessica's uncanny ability to spot mechanical problems, her intuitive understanding of weather patterns, her calm demeanor in situations that stressed other pilots, all of it had been carefully controlled demonstrations of much greater underlying talent. Phoenix, with skills like this, you should be commanding a squadron, not flying routine transport missions. Command brings visibility. Visibility brings scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to situations where you have to choose between orders and conscience. Another system alarm interrupted their conversation. The backup hydraulic system was now operating at 30% pressure, and Jessica could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly sluggish. Each control input required more physical effort, and the response delays were growing longer. "We're approaching the point where manual control won't be sufficient," Rodriguez observed, monitoring the system status. "Then we'll have to make it sufficient." Jessica's hands moved across the controls with increased intensity, her movements becoming a complex dance of anticipation and compensation. She was no longer simply flying the aircraft, she was becoming one with it, sensing its needs and responses through some combination of training, instinct, and inherited genius. The storm began to show signs of weakening around them, but their mechanical situation continued to deteriorate. Warning lights illuminated the instrument panel in a cascade of amber and red, each one representing another system pushed beyond its design limits. "Navigation system is completely dead," Rodriguez reported. "We're flying on compass heading and dead reckoning." "That's enough. I know where we are." "How can you possibly know that?" Jessica pointed through the storm-darkened sky toward a barely visible break in the clouds. "Wind patterns, pressure changes, the way the lightning is reflecting off the cloud formations. We're 47 minutes from Landstuhl, bearing 270 degrees. Rodriguez checked their compass heading and fuel consumption calculations. Her estimate was impossibly precise given their circumstances, but somehow he found himself believing her completely. "Phoenix, when we get through this, you need to stop hiding what you can do. The Air Force needs pilots like you. First, we have to get through this." As if summoned by her words, the aircraft shuddered violently as the navigation system failure cascaded into the flight control computers. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as they lost all electronic assistance, leaving Jessica with nothing but manual controls and her extraordinary abilities to guide 180 lives through the remainder of the storm. The flight control computer failure left Jessica flying the massive transport aircraft entirely by manual controls, her hands gripping the yoke with white-knuckled determination as she fought to maintain level flight. Every control input now required significant physical effort, and the aircraft's responses came with dangerous delays that demanded perfect timing to prevent catastrophic loss of control. "Phoenix, we've got a decision to make," Rodriguez said, studying their fuel consumption charts with growing concern. "We're burning fuel faster than calculated due to the storm conditions and constant maneuvering." Jessica's eyes flicked to the fuel gauges while maintaining her precise control inputs. The numbers told a story she didn't want to accept. They had enough fuel to reach either Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which offered long runways and perfect weather conditions, or continue to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, which had the specialized trauma facilities their wounded passengers desperately needed. "What's the difference in flight time?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would force an impossible choice. "Ramstein is 90 minutes out with favorable winds. Landstuhl is 65 minutes, but we'd be landing with minimum fuel reserves in deteriorating weather conditions." Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom with urgent medical updates. "Cockpit, this is Doc. We have 4 patients who won't survive another hour without immediate surgical intervention. Their conditions are deteriorating rapidly." Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, seeing her father's face as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. Colonel Marcus Carter had faced this same type of choice 15 years ago: follow safe, conventional procedures, or risk everything to save lives that conventional wisdom said couldn't be saved. "We're going to Landstuhl," Jessica announced, her voice carrying the same quiet determination that had defined her father's final mission. "Phoenix, that's incredibly risky. If we encounter any delays or have to execute a missed approach, We won't have fuel for an alternate landing site. Then we won't miss the approach. Rodriguez studied her profile, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of the legendary pilots he had served with in combat zones. You're sure about this? Those soldiers back there trusted their country to bring them home safely. Ramstein gets them home alive. Landstuhl gets them home whole. Jessica banked the aircraft toward Landstuhl, committing them to a course that offered no margin for error. The storm continued to buffet the C-130, but her extraordinary piloting skills kept them on track despite the manual controls and deteriorating mechanical systems. "Phoenix, I need to ask you something," Rodriguez said, as they penetrated deeper into German airspace. "Back there, when you said you knew where we were despite having no navigation equipment, how is that possible?" "My father taught me to read the sky like a map. Wind patterns, pressure changes, the way storms move across terrain. It all tells a story if you know how to listen. That's not normal pilot training." My father wasn't a normal pilot. As they approached German airspace, Rodriguez attempted to establish radio contact with Landstuhl, approach control. Static filled their headsets, punctuated by broken transmissions that painted a disturbing picture of conditions at their destination. "Landstuhl approach. This is Mercy Flight 77, requesting priority landing clearance for medical emergency," Rodriguez transmitted. The response came through heavy static. "Mercy Flight 77. Be advised, Landstuhl is currently under attack by insurgent forces. Runway is taking sporadic mortar fire. Recommend divert to Ramstein immediately." Jessica's hands tightened on the controls as the implications sank in. Their destination wasn't just experiencing bad weather. It was an active combat zone where enemy forces were specifically targeting the medical facility they needed to reach. "Approach. What's the current status of medical facilities?" Jessica transmitted. "Mercy Flight. Trauma Center is operational, but runway conditions are dangerous. We have intermittent mortar attacks and small arms fire in the vicinity of the airfield." Rodriguez turned to Jessica with disbelief written across his face. "Phoenix, we can't land at an airfield under enemy fire. That's suicide. Those 4 critical patients won't survive the extra time to reach Ramstein. And none of us will survive a mortar round hitting our aircraft during landing." Jessica stared through the storm-darkened windscreen toward their destination, knowing that every minute of delay meant another soldier might die from wounds that could be treated if they could just reach the trauma center. The choice before her was identical to the one that had destroyed her father's career: follow safe procedures or risk everything for the chance to save lives. "Captain, I need you to trust me one more time." "Phoenix, this isn't about trust. This is about flying into an active combat zone with a damaged aircraft and no fuel reserves for a second attempt. Then we'll have to get it right the first time." Jessica banked the aircraft toward Landstuhl, committing them to an approach that would either save 180 lives or end them all in a ball of fire on a runway under enemy attack. The approach to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center unfolded like a descent into hell. Through the storm-darkened sky, Jessica could see muzzle flashes illuminating the perimeter of the airfield as ground forces engaged insurgent positions. Tracer rounds streaked across the runway approach path, while mortar explosions sent geysers of dirt and debris into the air around the medical facility. "Mercy Flight 77, this is Landstuhl Tower," crackled the radio transmission, barely audible through heavy static. "Runway 27 is taking intermittent fire. We have a brief window between mortar attacks. You'll need to execute a combat approach, steep descent, minimal time in the pattern." Jessica studied the tactical situation below while fighting to maintain control of the increasingly unresponsive aircraft. The manual flight controls required constant physical effort, and fuel gauges showed they were operating on fumes with no margin for error. One missed approach would mean certain crash landing. "Phoenix, this is insane," Rodriguez said, watching explosions bloom around the airfield. We're flying a damaged transport into an active firefight with wounded soldiers aboard. Captain, those soldiers have already been through one firefight. We're going to make sure they survive this one. Jessica began the combat approach, dropping the C-130 through the storm in a steep spiral that would minimize their exposure to ground fire. The technique required precise timing and control inputs that pushed the damaged aircraft to its absolute limits. Every movement of the yoke demanded perfect coordination to prevent the heavily loaded transport from entering an unrecoverable stall. Mercy Flight! Be advised we have enemy spotters calling in mortar fire on aircraft movements. The tower controller transmitted urgently. You'll have approximately 90 seconds from initial approach to touchdown before they can adjust fire. 90 seconds to execute a perfect landing in a damaged aircraft with manual controls only, while enemy forces tried to kill them with indirect fire. Jessica felt her father's presence beside her as she committed to the approach that would either save 180 lives or end them all. The aircraft plunged through the final layer of storm clouds, revealing the chaos below in stark detail. The runway was cratered from previous mortar impacts. Emergency vehicles raced across the tarmac with lights flashing, and medical personnel waited in protected positions to receive the wounded passengers. "Gear down," Jessica commanded, feeling the aircraft shudder as the landing gear extended into the slipstream. The additional drag made the already sluggish controls even more unresponsive, but she compensated with inputs that seemed to anticipate the aircraft's behavior by several seconds. "Phoenix, you're coming in too fast," Rodriguez warned, monitoring their approach speed. "I know. Trust me." Jessica was deliberately maintaining excess airspeed to ensure she could maneuver around mortar impacts if necessary. The technique violated every standard landing procedure, but standard procedures didn't account for flying into active combat zones with damaged aircraft. A mortar round exploded 50 yards to the left of the runway centerline, sending shrapnel whistling past the cockpit windows. Jessica never flinched, her hands making minute adjustments to keep them aligned with the runway despite the blast effects and crosswinds. 30 seconds to touchdown, Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with tension. Another explosion, this one closer to the runway threshold. Jessica could see the insurgent mortar team's adjustment pattern. They were walking their fire across the approach path, trying to time their next round to coincide with the aircraft's landing. "Mercy Flight, mortar impact predicted on runway in 20 seconds, the tower warned. Jessica did something that defied all conventional wisdom. Instead of aborting the approach, she increased their descent rate, dropping the massive transport toward the runway in a controlled dive that would get them on the ground before the next mortar round arrived. "Jesus Christ, Phoenix!" Rodriguez shouted as the runway rushed up to meet them at an impossible angle. At the last possible second, Jessica flared the aircraft with a precision that bordered on supernatural. The C-130's main gear touched down exactly on the runway centerline, with barely a bump, despite their excessive approach speed and the damaged flight controls. The mortar round exploded harmlessly behind them as Jessica applied maximum braking, the aircraft's tires smoking as they decelerated rapidly. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them as they rolled toward the medical facility, where trauma teams waited to receive their precious cargo. "Mercy Flight 77, welcome to Landstuhl," the tower controller transmitted, relief evident in his voice. "That was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed." Jessica brought the aircraft to a stop directly in front of the trauma center, positioning it to minimize the time needed to transfer wounded soldiers to medical care. As the engines wound down, she slumped in her seat, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. "Phoenix," Rodriguez said quietly, "what you just did. That wasn't just exceptional flying, that was impossible flying." Through the cockpit windows, they watched medical teams rush aboard to begin transferring the wounded soldiers. Each life they had carried through the storm and combat zone represented a family that would remain whole, a future that would continue, a debt that could never be fully repaid. Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice came over the intercom with tears of relief evident in her tone. "Cockpit, this is Doc. All patients stable and ready for transfer. You just saved 180 lives. Jessica closed her eyes, feeling her father's spirit finally at peace. She had faced the same impossible choice that destroyed his career, but this time the outcome was different. This time, exceptional ability combined with moral courage had saved lives without destroying the pilot who wielded them. The medical evacuation proceeded with military precision as trauma teams transferred the wounded soldiers from the aircraft to the hospital. Jessica remained in the cockpit, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline and physical exhaustion of flying the damaged aircraft through impossible conditions. Through the windscreen, she watched each stretcher disappear into the medical facility, knowing that her decision to risk everything had given these soldiers a chance at full recovery. General Hayes appeared at the aircraft's crew entrance, her uniform crisp despite having flown through the night to reach Landstuhl. She climbed into the cockpit with measured steps, her steel-grey eyes taking in the scene of controlled chaos around the instrument panel, where warning lights still illuminated multiple system failures. "Major Carter," the general said, settling into the flight engineer's seat behind Jessica. "We need to talk." Rodriguez excused himself, leaving Jessica alone with the commanding officer whose approval could make or break her military career. The silence stretched between them as General Hayes studied the woman who had just accomplished what her most experienced pilots had deemed impossible. 15 years ago, I served as a lieutenant colonel under your father's command, General Hayes began, her voice carrying no judgment, only fact. Marcus Carter was the finest natural pilot I ever encountered, and one of the most principled officers I've had the privilege to serve alongside. Jessica turned to face her, surprised by the personal revelation. "You were there during his court-martial?" "I testified on his behalf. I told the tribunal that Colonel Carter had saved 300 civilian lives through extraordinary flying skills and moral courage. The panel wasn't interested in hearing about lives saved, only orders disobeyed. Then you know what happened to him afterward. The forced retirement, the loss of pension, the way the Air Force abandoned him after 20 years of distinguished service." General Hayes nodded slowly. "I also know that he never regretted his decision. Your father understood that some choices transcend military regulations, that there are moments when doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. Is that why you gave me this mission? Because you suspected I might be capable of the same kind of flying? I've been watching your career for years, Major Carter. Your service record shows consistent competence, but I've received reports from maintenance crews about your uncanny ability to diagnose mechanical problems. Flight instructors have mentioned your intuitive understanding of weather patterns. And Captain Rodriguez has filed several incident reports describing your exceptional performance in emergency situations." Jessica felt a chill of recognition. "You've been investigating me. I've been hoping you would stop hiding what you're capable of achieving." General Hayes leaned forward, her expression intense. "The Air Force needs pilots like you, Jessica. Not pilots who follow orders blindly, but aviators who can make impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. My father made impossible decisions. It destroyed his career and his life. Your father's situation was different. He was operating in a military culture that valued conformity over excellence, obedience over innovation. That culture has changed, largely because of lessons learned from cases like his." Through the cockpit windows, they watched the last of the wounded soldiers being transferred to the medical facility. Each successful transfer represented a life that would continue because Jessica had chosen to reveal her extraordinary abilities when it mattered most. "Major Carter, I'm offering you a choice that your father never had," General Hayes continued. "I want you to join a special operations unit that handles missions requiring exceptional piloting skills. Missions where conventional approaches fail and only extraordinary ability can succeed." "What kind of missions?" humanitarian evacuations from disaster zones, combat search and rescue in hostile territory, medical emergencies that require flying through conditions that would ground normal aircraft, situations where saving lives requires pilots willing to risk everything. Jessica considered the offer, understanding its implications. Accepting would mean abandoning the safe anonymity she had cultivated for 15 years, stepping into the spotlight that had ultimately destroyed her father's career. "General, what guarantee do I have that I won't face the same fate as my father?" "None," General Hayes replied honestly. "Exceptional ability always carries risk. But I can promise you this, you'll be serving in a unit that values moral courage as much as flying skill, where doing what's right is considered more important than following standard procedures. And if I refuse, then you continue flying routine transport missions, hiding your abilities and wondering what might have been. But after what you accomplished today, I don't think that's who you are anymore." Jessica looked out at the medical facility, where 180 soldiers were receiving life-saving treatment because she had chosen to risk everything rather than play it safe. The ghost of her father's court-martial would always haunt her, but today had proven that exceptional ability combined with moral courage could save lives without destroying the pilot who wielded them. "General, I have one condition. Name it. Captain Rodriguez comes with me. He trusted me when no one else would, and I won't leave him behind." General Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the cockpit. "Already approved. Rodriguez has been recommended for the same unit based on his performance during this mission." Jessica extended her hand to the general, feeling the weight of 15 years of self-imposed limitations lifting from her shoulders. "Then I accept. Welcome to the Phoenix Squadron, Major Carter. I think your father would be proud." 6 months later, Jessica stood in the briefing room of Phoenix Squadron's classified facility, studying satellite images of a humanitarian crisis unfolding in the mountains of Afghanistan. A massive earthquake had trapped 200 aid workers in a remote valley with weather conditions and terrain, making conventional rescue impossible. The mission parameters were eerily familiar. Fly through impossible conditions to save lives that standard procedures couldn't reach. "The approach corridor is less than 50 feet wide between mountain peaks," briefed Colonel Martinez, the squadron's operations officer. "Weather reports show zero visibility with severe downdrafts that have already claimed 2 rescue helicopters. Conventional wisdom says it can't be done." Jessica smiled at the phrase that had once terrified her. Conventional wisdom said our landstool mission was impossible too. Around the briefing table sat the 12 pilots of Phoenix Squadron, each one selected for their combination of exceptional flying ability and unwavering moral courage. Captain Rodriguez occupied the seat beside her. His confidence in her abilities now absolute after witnessing her transformation from hidden talent to acknowledged expert. "Phoenix 1, you'll be flying the new MV-22 Osprey with enhanced navigation systems," Colonel Martinez continued. "The aircraft's tilt-rotor design should give you the maneuverability needed to navigate the mountain corridor." "What's the passenger capacity?" 50 per trip. You'll need to make 4 runs to evacuate everyone, assuming weather conditions don't deteriorate further." Jessica studied the mission profile, her mind automatically calculating wind patterns, approach angles, and the precise control inputs needed to thread an aircraft through a mountain pass in zero visibility conditions. The challenge excited rather than intimidated her. This was what she had been born to do. "Ma'am, there's something else," added Lieutenant Thompson, the squadron's intelligence officer. "We've received word that several of the trapped aid workers are critically injured and won't survive much longer without immediate medical evacuation." The familiar weight of impossible choices settled on Jessica's shoulders, but this time she embraced rather than feared the responsibility. "Then we launch immediately." 2 hours later, Jessica lifted the MV-22 Osprey into the storm-darkened sky above Afghanistan. Rodriguez beside her as co-pilot, and a full medical team in the cargo bay. The aircraft's unique design allowed it to take off like a helicopter before transitioning to airplane mode for efficient cruise flight. But the mountain rescue would require capabilities that pushed even this advanced machine to its limits. "Phoenix 1, this is base operations," crackled the radio. "Weather reports show conditions deteriorating rapidly. Recommend you abort and wait for improved visibility." "Negative, base. We have people depending on us." Jessica guided the Osprey through the mountain passes with the same supernatural precision she had demonstrated during the Landstuhl mission. Her hands moved across the controls with fluid grace, reading wind patterns and terrain features through instruments alone while navigating corridors that existed only in her mind's eye. "Jesus, Phoenix," Rodriguez whispered as they threaded between mountain peaks with mere feet of clearance on either side. "How do you know where we are?" "I can feel the mountains," Jessica replied, her voice calm despite the incredible complexity of what she was accomplishing. "Every peak creates its own wind signature, its own pressure pattern. You just have to listen to what the aircraft is telling you." The first evacuation run succeeded flawlessly. 50 aid workers safely extracted from the disaster zone and delivered to medical facilities in Kabul. The second and third runs followed with equal precision, Jessica's extraordinary abilities allowing her to accomplish what meteorologists and aviation experts had declared impossible. On the fourth and final run, disaster struck. A massive aftershock triggered an avalanche that blocked the original extraction site, forcing Jessica to attempt a landing in an area barely large enough for the Osprey's rotor span. The approach required split-second timing and control inputs that defied human capability. "Phoenix, the landing zone is too small," Rodriguez warned, watching the terrain rush past their windows. "We need to abort." "Those are the last 50 people, Captain. We don't leave anyone behind." Jessica brought the Osprey down through the swirling snow and debris, with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. The aircraft touched down in the tiny clearing, with inches to spare on all sides, rotors barely clearing the surrounding trees as the final group of aid workers rushed aboard. As they lifted off from the disaster zone for the last time, Jessica felt her father's presence more strongly than ever. Colonel Marcus Carter had taught her that exceptional ability carried the responsibility to use it for others, regardless of personal cost. Today, she had honored that legacy while forging her own path forward. "Phoenix 1, this is General Hayes," came the transmission as they approached Kabul. "Outstanding work out there. All 200 aid workers successfully evacuated with 0 casualties." "Thank you, Ma'am. Just doing our job." "Major Carter, that wasn't just doing your job. That was redefining what's possible." Jessica smiled as the lights of Kabul appeared through the storm, knowing that she had finally found her place in the world. Phoenix Squadron represented everything her father had believed in, using exceptional ability to serve others, making impossible choices to save lives, and proving that moral courage combined with extraordinary skill could change the world one mission at a time. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Jessica walked slowly along the perfectly manicured pathways. Her dress-blue uniform adorned with ribbons that told the story of 7 years spent pushing the boundaries of what aviation could accomplish. In her hand, she carried a single white rose, its petals still fresh with morning dew. She paused before a simple granite headstone that bore the inscription, "Colonel Marcus Carter, United States Air Force. Beloved father and pilot, courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." The quote had been his favorite, words he had lived by even when they cost him everything. "Hello, Dad," Jessica said softly, placing the rose at the base of the stone. "I thought you'd want to know how things turned out." 7 years had transformed Jessica from a pilot hiding her abilities into one of the most decorated aviators in Air Force history. Phoenix Squadron had completed over 200 impossible missions, saving thousands of lives in situations where conventional rescue attempts had failed. Hurricane evacuations, earthquake responses, combat search and rescue operations in hostile territory, each mission had proven that extraordinary ability guided by moral courage could accomplish the impossible. Rodriguez made colonel last month, she continued, settling onto the bench facing her father's grave. He's commanding his own squadron now, teaching other pilots that sometimes the most dangerous path is actually the safest one. He still tells the story of our Landstuhl mission to every new pilot who joins the program. The price of her transformation hadn't been without cost. The constant pressure of impossible missions had taken its toll, leaving her with recurring nightmares about the lives she couldn't save and the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. But unlike her father, she had found a military culture that valued her contributions rather than punishing her independence. General Hayes retired last year, but not before establishing the Carter Institute for Advanced Aviation Ethics at the Air Force Academy. They're teaching future pilots that following orders and following conscience don't have to be mutually exclusive choices. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around the cemetery, carrying with it the distant sound of aircraft engines from nearby Reagan National Airport. Jessica listened to the familiar rhythm, remembering how her father had taught her to identify different aircraft types by their engine signatures alone. "I met someone, Dad. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a flight surgeon with Phoenix Squadron. She understands what we do, why we take the risks we take. She knows that sometimes saving lives requires risking everything." Jessica smiled at the memory of Sarah's reaction to their first mission together, watching in amazement as Jessica threaded their aircraft through a hurricane to reach stranded civilians. The shadows grew longer as afternoon approached, but Jessica remained on the bench, sharing 7 years of memories with the man who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to serve others. She told him about the children evacuated from war zones, the disaster victims pulled from impossible situations, the fellow pilots who had learned to push beyond their perceived limitations. "The hardest part isn't the flying anymore," she admitted. "It's the weight of knowing that every decision affects so many lives. But I understand now why you made the choices you did. Some things are worth risking everything for." A young couple approached with their small daughter, the child carrying flowers, toward a nearby grave. Jessica watched them, remembering her own childhood visits to this same cemetery, when her father would bring her to pay respects to fallen comrades and teach her about the cost of service. "I have something to tell you, Dad," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Phoenix Squadron is being expanded into an international program. Pilots from allied nations are coming to train in our methods, learning to use exceptional ability for humanitarian purposes. Your vision of aviation serving humanity is spreading around the world." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her of countless sunrises witnessed from aircraft cockpits, Jessica stood and straightened her uniform. She had one more mission briefing to attend, another impossible situation that required extraordinary solutions. "I won't let them forget what you taught me," she promised, touching the headstone one final time. "That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. That exceptional ability carries the responsibility to serve others, and that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that seem impossible." Jessica walked away from the grave with the confident stride of someone who had found her purpose in life. Behind her, the white rose caught the last rays of sunlight, a symbol of love and remembrance that would weather the seasons just as her father's legacy would endure through every life she saved and every pilot she inspired. The impossible had become possible, and the cycle of courage continued. As the final echoes of Jessica's story fade into the silence of Arlington Cemetery, we're left with a profound truth that resonates far beyond the cockpit of any aircraft. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite that fear when lives hang in the balance. Jessica Carter's journey from a pilot hiding her extraordinary abilities to becoming a beacon of hope for impossible rescues teaches us that our greatest strengths often lie dormant within us, waiting for the moment when moral conviction overcomes personal safety. Her father's legacy wasn't destroyed by his court-martial. It was immortalized through his daughter's courage to step out of the shadows when others needed her most. The lesson here transcends aviation. In our daily lives, we all face moments when we must choose between the safe path and the right path. Whether you're a teacher fighting for a struggling student, a doctor advocating for a patient, a parent protecting your family, or simply someone standing up for what's right, Jessica's story reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to let fear dictate their choices. Phoenix Squadron represents more than just an elite military unit. It symbolizes what becomes possible when exceptional ability is guided by unwavering moral courage. Every impossible mission they completed, every life they saved, stands as proof that the boundaries of what we consider possible exist only in our minds. Your story doesn't end here. I want to hear from you. What impossible situation in your own life needs the courage that Jessica demonstrated? What hidden abilities are you keeping in the shadows that could change someone's world if you had the courage to reveal them? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story of courage and redemption moved you, write the word Phoenix so I know you made it to the end. Your engagement helps spread these stories of inspiration to others who might need to hear that the impossible is just another word for not yet attempted. Don't let this be the end of your journey with stories that challenge you to be more than you thought possible. Check out the other incredible tales of courage, sacrifice, and triumph waiting for you in the suggested videos. Each one is crafted to remind you that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Remember, your courage could be someone else's miracle. The question isn't whether you have what it takes. It's whether you'll choose to use it when the moment comes. The sky isn't the limit, it's just the beginning.